Awesome. And Mr. Cox, what got you interested in the topic of today's conference, which is America's national debt?
Well, I suppose serving in Congress for so many years, for 9 terms, portion of that was on the Budget Committee and the Joint Economic Committee, the Financial Services Committee. And prior to that time, I had been a lawyer in the White House working with President Reagan, where I was responsible for developing legislation on reform of the budget process. And subsequently, I chaired the Securities and Exchange Commission. So I've been around finance, both in the private sector and in the government sector through my government employment. And then for 20 years outside of government, practicing law in corporate finance. So all of the interrelationships between the federal government's budget and the private sector economy have been of surpassing interest to me for my entire career.
Yes, sir, and that background, I'm sure, influences what you were able to speak to in the panel earlier today. What is one thing that you want attendees of this conference to have taken away from your talk today?
Well, not only from my talk, but really from the entire day, because the panels have been superb and they are populated with experts in history, economics, and budgeting, many of them with a lot of hands-on real-world experience in government and in the private sector. The focus of this whole day has been on the explosion in federal debt and the breaking of faith with the long-standing norm in the United States that started with Alexander Hamilton. We've referred to it throughout the day as the Hamiltonian norm, that whatever your political party, wherever you come from on the political spectrum, faith in the US dollar and the creditworthiness of the United States is essential to accomplishing your objectives. The United States government cannot serve the people if it is not creditworthy. So creditworthiness requires paying your bills, being reliable, and when you borrow, paying it back. Those things collectively comprise what we're calling the Hamiltonian norm. Getting people to focus on this really is what was my purpose in being here, and it's the purpose of the whole seminar.
Yes, sir. So we've been talking a lot about the erosion of the Hamiltonian norm, what that means for America's debt policy. What's something you think is most misunderstood about this topic by Americans?
Well, so I'm guessing you're still in your 20s?
Yes, sir.
And I'm in my 70s. So we have different interests here. The phrase free stuff was bandied about in a recent presidential election. The notion that there is such a thing as free stuff is probably at bottom what is most threatening to people of your generation. When you are my age, or actually well before that, let's say you find yourself in Congress when you're 40 or 50, you will find as a senator or congressman that you have discretionary authority over just a tiny fraction of all of the money that's collected in taxes every year by the federal government. So you are a policymaker, you're trying to deal with the problems that will in the future be facing America, and you'll have no money with which to do it. And what do I mean by that? Interest on the national debt as it presently stands at $34 trillion right now in 2024 is more than the entire US defense budget. It's growing at such a rapid rate without any discipline that it's going to continue to eat away at all available revenues. So right now, 1/3 of all the income taxes collected by the federal government from individual Americans goes to nothing but interest on the debt. It's as if you took all of that money and brought it to Washington and built a big funeral pyre and lit it on fire. People get nothing in exchange for it, but they worked hard to make that money, and as you know, most taxes come from working people who are not the ultra super wealthy, because even at a confiscatory rate of taxation, taking all the money away from the top 1% doesn't really make a dent. You've got to, in the end, collect taxes from a much broader base. And so the people that are being injured here are truly everyday Americans, and especially the next generation.
Yes, sir. I think that impact of the national debt on the taxation of everyday Americans is one of the reasons that President Coolidge thought that it was moral imperative to control the debt. What would you say is most important for Americans to take away from President Coolidge's policy with regards to budgeting and the national debt when thinking about how do we tackle this really critical problem?
President Coolidge was famous for focusing on what he called economy in government. So he wanted to make sure we weren't wasting money. The federal government, in my experience, having worked in it for many decades, is extraordinarily wasteful compared to the private sector. In the private sector, people that are losing money pay a penalty pretty quickly. They have to lay off employees, they stop advertising, their business shrinks, maybe they go out of business. But they learn very, very quickly that it doesn't pay to be wasteful. In the federal government, there is no such penalty. The government isn't set up in a way that you can put responsibility on any individual person for waste. And so the government keeps on growing regardless of whether or not it's efficient, regardless of whether or not it's serving the customers better. And we see this even at the state level. If you're in most states, going to the Department of Motor Vehicles is no fun. All they're doing is issuing pieces of paper. They could figure it out and be efficient, but there's something inherent when the government is not responsible for the bottom line in being wasteful. So I think one of the major things that Coolidge deserves credit for is for focusing relentless attention from the top down on efficiency and economy and government, because he really understood he was dealing with other people's money. It wasn't his money.
And to tackle this problem, maybe to restore that idea of economy to the federal government, what do you think are the first sources of waste that need to be attempted to resolve?
So there are so many opportunities to save money, but let's start with the Defense Department because people are well aware that we need a national defense. They wouldn't want to zero it out and make it go away. But the cost to us of waste in the federal defense budget is very serious. It means that we are not meeting threats to the nation's very existence that might materialize from adversaries. So, scrubbing manpower, or these days, I don't know what the proper word is, but I'm sure it's not manpower, because we rely very heavily on women in the military and on people of all stripes. So, making sure that we are utilizing our people, the kind of human resources discipline that you would have in the private sector. In the enormous workforce of the Defense Department is a great place to start. And then I'd replicate that, across the board. It would take some real direction from the executive branch, ultimately from political appointees. If a president like Coolidge wanted to make this an issue, and if cabinet secretaries were appointed with the idea that they're going to make sure that we get rid of fat and waste, and that we're efficiently managing the bureaucracy, I think that would be very achievable.
Absolutely. That's a great vision of how to move forward. Is there anything that you didn't get a chance to speak to on your panel earlier today that you wanted to share with the audience of this conference?
Yeah, so one of the things that came up in my panel, where I was dealing with the rise and fall of the national debt in the World War I era, was the relationship between borrowing and taxes. Woodrow Wilson was president, of course, in the World War I era. As he asked Congress to declare war against Germany in 1917, he warned the Congress of the evil, that's the word he used, that would come from inflation and from massive borrowing, and he did not want the war, World War I, to be paid for with just borrowing. He wanted to make sure that we, to the maximum extent possible, paid as we went. And his Treasury Secretary, William McAdoo, then followed through on that and came up with a pay-as-you-go policy that was 1/3 current taxation and 2/3 borrowing. Subsequently, President Harding, who then tragically died, followed immediately by President Coolidge, had the job of paying down what was at that point an enormous amount of debt. In today's currency, it would be $500 billion that was built up in new debt just in a few years, at a time when the annual budget was about $725 million. So a big chunk of new debt, and paying down that debt meant thinking about, what's the right tax rate. During the war, the tax rates on income had risen to 77%. And what they discovered is that it didn't work, that people ostensibly in that income tax bracket rearranged their affairs so they wouldn't have that taxable income. They did it in the main by shifting to state and municipal bonds that paid no taxes. Subsequently, they learned, both with tax rates and with the issuance of victory bonds after the war, that if they were tax exempt, the bonds would sell better, and if they dropped that 77% rate down to a reasonable level, they dropped it down all the way to 25%, that people in a voluntary tax system would not move all their money out of taxable sources, and the federal government would actually be able to grow the economy and collect hefty taxes at the same time. So we need to think about that today. We need to make sure that we don't think we just wave a magic wand and raise tax rates and it will turn out well. We have to focus on growing the economy and making sure that voluntary compliance stays high simultaneously.
If I could follow up on that, what would implementing this philosophy of scientific taxation look like today? Maybe where would we start? Because the tax code's a lot more complicated than it was in Coolidge's
It is.
day.
I think one of the things that would make it easier for people to comply and to not have to always rearrange their business affairs according to tax purposes as opposed to economic efficiency would be to make sure that we thoroughly index for inflation the tax system. The biggest problem right now is that what we call capital gains, literally when you sell your car, right? It's a capital asset. If I sell my clunker, which is Plymouth Valiant from 30 years ago, but somehow it's worth $5,000 today. Maybe I bought it for $500. So $500 back when I bought it was worth a lot more. $5,000 today not worth anything like what it would have been worth back then. The tax system pays no attention to that, and it pretends that I have $4,500 of economic gain and taxes me on that. Indexing capital gains for inflation would prevent taking money away from people that don't have any real economic gain. So that would allow people to make their business decisions, their economic decisions, their personal decisions, whether to sell the Plymouth Valiant on the basis of real life instead of the artificial aspects of the tax code.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to interview you, get a little more about your thoughts and your thoughtful participation in this panel here today.
Happy to join you and happy to be part of the panel today.
Appreciate it, sir.